Hey, it's your guy Tyrrell back with the interviews. Manchester City's unbeaten run in the Premier League came to an end, this time at the hands of Chelsea. How did Chelsea do it? Where did Manchester City go wrong? Don't worry, here are the interviews. We've got you covered. So on this edition of the interviews, we're going to break down how Chelsea beat Manchester City. So before we get into today's video, don't forget to give our video a thumbs up if you do enjoy it. The bell below does give you daily notifications regarding our organic, unfiltered soccer/footy analysis. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel. In today's video, we're going to break down the first half, see how Manchester City were so dominant, and how Chelsea were able to shockingly go ahead in the first half. Then get to the second half, see what Chelsea did right after going ahead, and how City were looking to rescue a point. But first, let's get to the starting lineups. We look at Chelsea. The big surprise was that Eden Hazard started up front, which means there was no Giroud and no Morata. Out in the wider areas, Willian played from the left, Pedro from the right. In midfield, no surprises there, Kovacic, Conte, and Jorginho. Then we get to Manchester City, no Sergio Aguero. Up front, they went Raheem Sterling. In the wider areas, Sané and Mahrez. And then in midfield, Kevin De Bruyne is still out, so they went with Fernandinho, David Silva, and Bernardo Silva. So now let's look to see how Pep Guardiola and Mauricio Sarri look to approach the game and who had the upper hand in the first half. The main talking point heading into the game was how Chelsea were going to approach it, especially without Giroud and Morata. When we have them here, you have Hazard up front. How were they? Were they going to press from the front? Were they going to try and close City down and push their men forward and risk being bypassed? Were they going to sit off? We haven't seen that from Sarri this season. They did do the latter. They did press at times with Hazard leading the line. What happened here was that Hazard would step forward. Then you'd have Willian and Pedro. And what you could do here is obviously you could have them out in the wider area and then have the midfield deal with the midfield. The other option that they could go, especially if Fernandinho dropped deeper, was have the front three push out there and then rely on the shuttlers to get out into position there, get out into position to the wide players. But the key thing here was that they still have Ederson, who's able to play passes. So even if they play that way, it's still a 4v3. They still have ways to play out of the back. And that's probably why Sarri only asked his team to press when they were all able to push forward and they were unison. Because if they were disjointed, there was always a chance that they would be outnumbered in midfield and outnumbered in those areas, which would allow City to break forward. And that's kind of how you think Pep wanted to approach it. He probably assumed that they were going to push forward, they were going to try and press a bit higher, try to win the ball in City's half, which would allow Sané to break forward, which would allow Sterling to break forward, and would allow Mahrez to break forward. However, Sarri surprised all of us. He didn't do that. And when you look at the shape, they drop into that 4-5-1, but Pedro and Willian stay very narrow. That blocks off passes into the midfield banks. It blocks off passes into the half spaces. So that's probably why David Silva had some issues picking up the ball, because he stayed a bit higher, somewhat close to Azpilicueta at times, sometimes in between the bank of Conte and in between the bank of Pedro. But what happened there is that Conte often blocked off that path. We saw Bernardo Silva marked tightly by Kovacic. What happens that sometimes we saw Fernandinho drop off and you'd see Jorginho step to him. Chelsea were basically staying in their shape, trying to hold it for as long as they could, making it hard for City to play through the middle. And that is why they often played their passes out into the wider areas, and the position stayed the same. Sané held the width. You had David Silva kind of staying narrow to drag out Azpilicueta if need be, trying to pick up the ball in those spaces. That didn't really happen. When they did find ways to combine, what would happen there is that if they try to get the overload with Pedro dropping off, Rudiger was always available to come across and sweep up when need be. He was aware of the threat, so that was key. And Sané, like I said, if you have Silva there, just not enough service in behind for him, not enough long balls for him to run off the line to make a difference from those high positions. When you look to the right-hand side, Mahrez was holding the width. Walker was staying very narrow, so he's holding it. Willian was obviously coming to press him, but Kovacic did a good job of stepping to Bernardo Silva. In the earlier stages, like I said, Bernardo Silva's making runs in behind Alonso. That is what Manchester City wanted. But as the game grew on, Kovacic stuck to him. When Bernardo dropped off, Kovacic was there, always hassling, always carrying him, always sticking tight. And at times when Walker didn't have the ball and they try to get Mahrez in those 1v1 situations with Alonso, which is what what City wanted. They would have Willian drop off, so it was often 1v2, and City never had those individual battles that they probably had hoped for, and that was one of the reasons for their downfall. So that is why they couldn't create any chances in open play. Raheem Sterling did drop off a bit deeper to the sides of Jorginho, not really offering a threat. David Luiz followed him on a few occasions to ensure that he struggled and forced him off the ball. So that eventually led to Manchester City making a change and bringing Mahrez on to the central position, pushing out Sterling to the right. Mahrez offered a bit more. He was able to link play, drop off a bit deeper, but City weren't really getting much in terms of penetration in the final third. They weren't causing a threat. They weren't forcing Kepa into many saves. Like I said, a lot of it stemmed through transition, and we'll get to that in a bit. So when you think about it, how else were City really going to harm them? Because when you think about it, Chelsea, they had the press, they were getting into key positions, but Chelsea weren't really making the difference with the final ball. Pedro, Conte, all guilty of getting forward, Willian, but then making the final pass. Hazard was starved for service, but when he did get the balls in the channels, he was winning free kicks, and that was pivotal for them. But when you think about it, they tried to press Chelsea. Chelsea, when they had the opportunity, they tried to stop City. There's one in particular, because what happens is that when they have that there, Bernardo Silva, especially from goal kicks, was also dropping deeper as the City center backs pushed out wide. When the City center backs pushed out wide, you didn't really see Chelsea look to press from the front either. What they did do, because how the ball would be switched over, they would have Kovacic sometimes step in, they'd have Conte sometimes step in, and have the other two midfielders keep their shape. We didn't see that here. The one example that I'm going to show is when you have them dropping off a bit deeper. What you have here is you have Hazard, and you have Hazard sitting centrally. You have the wider players sitting on the center backs, but then again, you have only one Hazard on Fernandinho. You have Bernardo Silva free. And what happens there is that Kovacic now is tasked with going after Walker. So when he goes after Walker, the ball is played to Bernardo Silva. Bernardo Silva is easily able to skip by Willian and Hazard. But as he steps into danger, he plays it back to Stones. When he plays it back to Stones, that forces Willian there. Then he plays it back to Ederson. And now Pedro steps to Ederson. But the ball now is played, and as Mahrez drops off, Jorginho follows him, plays it to him, but again, Bernardo Silva still isn't picked up, so Bernardo Silva gets it, and when he plays it to Silva, who's running off Conte to that side, then they switch the ball out to Sterling, and that is how they were able to break forward. Ederson played a key role in what they were doing. They didn't have any options to stop Bernardo Silva when he dropped off a bit deeper. City were in full control in that sense, where they were able to play out of the back, and they didn't really have any issues. Chelsea never forced them into issues. The wider players held their width, so they're able to ping balls out to them if need be. So Chelsea were much better suited to sit off in that narrow bank of five, and that's how they were really getting their job done, keeping the wider players tucked in, having Hazard sit a bit deeper, and like I said, City didn't really have any goal-scoring opportunities from open play, switching the ball out wide. They didn't have anything in wider areas. They did force Chelsea into some nervy moments when they pressed from the front, and how they were doing that was they had the front three sitting on the back three that was dropping off. So they had Sterling on Jorginho, they had Sané stepping out to Rudiger, they had Mahrez stepping out to Luiz. If the ball was played out to Azpilicueta, we'd see Sané drop off back and press him if need be. Mahrez, on the other hand, when the ball was played out wide, sometimes they would have Bernardo step to Alonso, sometimes they'd have Walker step up. At one point, they had the fullbacks pushing forward to press from the front to help them close down, and then have the midfield deal with the midfield. But in that system, like we saw Kovacic stepping out to Walker, you can have the shuttlers press out as well in Bernardo Silva, in David Silva, moving into those areas. But that is where they were looking to get onto Chelsea. They were forcing them into issues. They were counter-pressing well. The build-up to the goal that they do concede does see one time Bernardo Silva, because as the game goes on, sometimes you can't have the front three pushing out into wider areas or pushing into the center back. So what would happen was that you would have them push out to wider areas. You'd have Sterling pick up Rudiger, then you'd have Bernardo Silva step, or if Sterling was picking up David Luiz, you'd have David Silva step to Rudiger. But here it was Sterling there, Bernardo Silva was supposed to step to Luiz, and he's able to ping that diagonal out, and that was kind of how they conceded the goal. When you break it down, you look at City, how they were trying to press, that was key. They were able to build out the back, but Chelsea's dropping off, keeping that mid block, squeezing high to ensure that there was no space between the lines for Silva to exploit. That played a key role, because now they were organized out in the wider areas. Sané never got involved. Mahrez and Sterling never really had a threat from open play. play. The midfield really were bogged down in their areas because they couldn't help combine with the wider players. So now let's get to City's chances and see how they were able to create them. And let's see how Chelsea were able to score goals, because as you could see, they didn't really have anything going for them. The counterattack was pretty flawed and they really struggled to get past Manchester City's press. So let's look at that and see where the chances were created. With that being said, a lot of Manchester City's chances did stem in transition. When we do break it down, we look to the first one. It's Jorginho being dispossessed by Fernandinho. What we end up having to see there is that once he wins the ball, he plays into Sterling, who is now free to run at goal. When he runs at goal, what happens here is that you have Sané holding off Azpilicueta narrow. He slides it to David Silva. Silva instantly plays it back to Sterling. It is a bit behind him. He probably should do better. He fires a tame effort on goal. But again, just by dispossessing Jorginho, they're able to quickly break on the counter, and that was pivotal. We look to another opportunity from a simple throw-in. We have Fernandinho and we have Sané step to Hazard. Azpilicueta throws it in. He gets the ball back. Sané ends up finding space in behind the midfield of Jorginho and Kovacic to play it into Mahrez. When he plays it into Mahrez, what happens here is that he locates Silva, making the run across Rudiger. He makes the run across Rudiger. He ends up playing it right back across Luis for Sané, but Sané's unable to get a shot off. But again, we're seeing them win the ball quickly, but defend in numbers, press in numbers, then push forward and get into good goal scoring opportunities. And that was a great opportunity. The other two chances that they did create, it stemmed when Mahrez did move centrally. So we'll get these guys back into their position. Mahrez moved centrally. Sterling moved out to the left-hand side or to the right-hand side. And that chance was a bit different because what happens is that you see a pass from Pedro played into a forward position. You see Bernardo Silva track back to win the ball. Once he wins the ball back and he intercepts it, the pass is played to the left of Jorginho for Mahrez. Now Mahrez is able to break forward. Rudiger steps to him. He skips by him. And once he skips by him, now you have the gap between Azpilicueta and Luis. You have Sané running off of him. Mahrez plays it in behind them for Sané. And what happens there is that he should score. Kepa comes out. He makes a big save. Sané didn't get that much distribution or that sort of service in the first half or throughout the entire game. But if you're able to get him to run off Azpilicueta, play balls over the top, he could do damage. That was their best opportunity. The final chance that they do create, it does stem from Chelsea trying to break forward with Willian and Marcos Alonso. The pass to Hazard, however, was intercepted. Then you have a combination with Sterling, with Fernandinho, and what happens eventually is that they're able to split the two in Alonso and Willian. So Alonso and Willian are split. The pass is played to Bernardo Silva, who looks to cut forward. Sterling is already on his way behind Alonso. The ball is now played over the top, reversed into that channel for Sterling. He picks it up. You have Alonso step to him. He's able to turn Alonso with these and break towards goal. All the Chelsea defenders are back. He pulls it back into the path of Leroy Sané. Sané now with his best opportunity, but Azpilicueta makes a vital block, and there you have it. He makes the block, and now City really wasted a lot of the good chances that they did have. And when you look at how Chelsea scored, it's just simple, direct football. David Luiz not pressed closely by Bernardo Silva here. He plays the diagonal out to Pedro, whose first touch is very good to get him across from Delph. Now what we end up seeing is that you have Willian already running beyond Kyle Walker. So when that happens, the end-up cross that's played in is cleared. It goes up in the air to Alonso. He finds Hazard, who is closed down. But when Hazard is closed down by Stones and Walker, Conte is at the edge of the box and no one is picking him up. So when he pulls it back into half space and City's backline drop into the box, Conte is able to break free. He's able to fire his effort past the keeper. That was Chelsea's one main opportunity in the first half. They didn't create much. They were unable to mount successful passes in the final third when they did try to break on the counterattack. So this was about City. They had their opportunities in transition. Chelsea were able to negate them in open play. They were unable to make the most of their chances, and some of them were quality. Chelsea go down the field. They make them pay. So now let's get to the second half and see how both sides look to approach the game and why City were unable to get back into it. So when we look at the second half, Guardiola was forced to make some sort of change as they trailed despite playing better in the first half. When we look at it, we have David Silva pushing a bit higher. When he pushes a bit higher, now what happens is that with Chelsea dropping off into their position, they were more into a 4-5-1. They had their base really set. They had Hazard sitting a bit higher and dropping a bit deeper. If the center backs had the ball, they would have the shuttlers push out. So if the ball was on the right, you would have Conte shift out. If you had it to the left, Kovacic would shift out. In wider areas, they doubled up very well. Willian and Pedro dropped off deeper. They protected their fullbacks. They ensured that there was no overloads, no real combinations down those sides. And that was a big problem for Manchester City because they weren't able to get anything through the middle. It was somewhat of a vintage Chelsea performance because there were a lot of questions as to whether Jorginho could play at the base, whether Conte could play at the right. They were very tight. They provided protection for each other. And that was key because City have a lot of players that could really harm you in those positions, and that wasn't the case there. But with Silva playing a bit higher, what ended up happening there was that now they had someone closer to Jorginho. They wanted Mahrez to press more efficiently, and he wasn't doing that, so that was a big problem for them throughout. But that is what they were trying to do, which left Bernardo and it left Fernandinho in midfield. So at times, if Silva dropped deeper, it still looked like a 4-1-4-1, but at other times, it looked like a 4-4-2 with Sané and Sterling pressing up the fullbacks, and then having, if you had Silva push out to the center back, you would have Bernardo Silva step to Jorginho. They were looking to get it to the press from the front, but they still looked a bit lackadaisical. It was a bit sluggish in the way they were doing it. We looked at the opportunities that Chelsea did create because Chelsea did have the better opportunities in the second half. The first one stems from the fact that, yeah, they were pressing. And what you see there is that they press from the front. You have Bernardo step to Jorginho. You have David Silva out to the left-hand side, which means he's covering Rudiger. Rudiger gets the ball. He ends up playing it back to Kepa. This forces Bernardo to step to him. Sané is a bit narrow at that time. What happens is the ball is played out to Azpilicueta. You have Sané step in there. So he steps in there, and the ball ends up playing to Conte, and Delph comes out a bit late. With Delph coming out a bit late, what you do see is Hazard dragging out John Stones, and he flicks it onto Kovacic, who's breaking forward. The ball is shifted out to Willian. When the ball is shifted out to Willian, what happens there is that you have Alonso bursting forward on the overlap. You have Sterling recovering. So you have eventually Willian cutting in on Sterling, getting across Fernandinho, who had recovered, but then he's fouled. That leads to the Willian free kick that is pushed aside by Ederson. But again, warning sign, right-hand side, City's pressing not working. Eventually, they did bring on Gabriel Jesus. He was brought on to obviously help them press better from the front, but he didn't offer much in terms of their overall build-up play. He didn't offer much around the goal, didn't really force the Chelsea center backs or Kepa into any big issues. We look to another opportunity. Ball is shifted from Azpilicueta. He locates Hazard, making the run around Laporte. So Laporte is now held up by Hazard, and at that same time you have Pedro dropping into the right and dragging out Delph. So he drags at Delph, and that leaves space for Conte to motor forward, and Hazard holds it up. He plays the overlapping run. Again, another forward Conte run, pulls it back for Pedro. He has a shot blocked, but again, it's a warning sign. It shows that they're finding space down that right-hand side. And the last opportunity that we're going to break down, because we did see that happen throughout the game, was the fact that you have Azpilicueta with the ball. Now what you have here is that you have Pedro dropping off. Now Delph is in a big predicament because Pedro's dropping off and Delph has to step to him, but Conte's there. So once Pedro gets the ball, he instantly plays it to Conte. Fernandinho does come across, but as he sees Pedro continue his run, he has to maintain his position. And now you have Conte breaking forward, who pulls it back for Willian, who controls it, but then fires a tame effort on goal. Not what you expect from Willian. They need to be better there. But the big problem that Chelsea were causing Manchester City was that Pedro was able to drop into that space right there, and you have obviously need Delph to step to him if they're pressing from the front the way that they were. But Conte was drifting into that right-hand position, and now you have a 2v1 because with Bernardo pressing and Silva pressing, you only have Fernandinho in the middle of the pitch, and that's a big problem because he has to hold that position. Conte was becoming more prominent going forward. They were building chances, and City didn't really know how to cope with it because they were trying to get back into the game. We saw Spilicueta eventually break forward and get past Delph before wrapping the ball around Laporte, and then it saw him foul Hazard. We saw a Luis diagonal to Pedro, who eventually cut in, slid the ball to Willian, who was held up by two markers, and then he pulled it back for Pedro, who forced the save out of the keeper. But besides that, Chelsea were causing them problems. City didn't know how to react. Their best chance came from a Kyle Walker free kick that was forced into a save. Sterling had problems really getting the better of Azpilicueta, and he had lots of help from Pedro. Mahrez was quiet. The change with Silva and Bernardo didn't really help. We saw Silva eventually come off for Gundogan. We saw Barkley come off for Kovacic. We saw then Loftus-Cheek replace Willian after Gundogan came on as well. But again, nothing really going for Manchester City. Chelsea were able to kill off the game with that Luis header. Hazard again was forcing City into many fouls, and he played his role to a T despite not getting the ball as much as you'd want to. And this was a positive second half performance from Chelsea after stealing the goal in the first half. City were the better side in the first half, but lacked penetration, didn't create many chances. Once Chelsea went ahead, they dropped off a bit deeper, were solid in that 4-5-1. They were able to find an advantage down the right-hand side, and this is the type of pragmatism that Chelsea fans want from Maurizio Sarri, whereas for Manchester City, they now look at the table and see Liverpool at the top, and they're going to have to respond and respond fast. But let me know what you guys think. Could Chelsea still challenge for the Premier League title? What about Manchester City? Do you think they could bounce back from this? Are they now going to be reeling down the table? Meet me in the comments below. Don't forget I upload videos every day, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. And that was your daily dose of the interviews.